The night everything changed. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Alina finally collapsed at the edge of the dark forest, her swollen belly heavy with the child she carried alone, her heart broken into 1,000 pieces by the man who had promised to love her forever but had vanished like morning mist when she needed him most. She was 23 years old, 7 months pregnant, and she had nowhere left to go in this cruel world that had turned its back on her the moment she became inconvenient to everyone who had once claimed to care about her well-being. Elena pressed her trembling hands against the cold mud beneath her, trying desperately to push herself back up, but her body had finally given out after walking for 2 days without proper food or shelter, and the baby inside her kicked weakly as if reminding her that she was not just fighting for her own survival anymore. The village behind her had made it clear that an unmarried pregnant woman was not welcome among decent people, and her own family had closed their door in her face when she had begged them for just one night of warmth. Her mother's eyes filled with shame rather than the love Elena had foolishly expected to find there. The forest before her was known by many dark names, and the villagers spoke of it only in whispers, crossing themselves and warning their children never to venture past the ancient stone markers that separated the world of the living from something far more terrifying that lurked within those twisted trees. They said a monster lived in the castle at the heart of the forest, a creature that had ruled these lands for centuries and drank the blood of anyone foolish enough to enter his territory. But Elena was too exhausted to feel afraid of old stories told to frighten children into obedience. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, the rain soaking through her thin dress and making her shiver violently, but she refused to die here in the mud like an animal when her baby still had a chance at life, if she could just find somewhere dry to rest for a few hours. The first trees of the forest loomed above her like giants standing guard, their branches reaching toward the stormy sky like skeletal fingers, and Elena pulled herself between them with the last reserves of strength she possessed in her weakened body. The deeper she went into the forest, the stranger everything became around her, and Elena noticed that the rain seemed to grow lighter the further she traveled from the edge, as if even the storm was afraid to follow her into this forbidden place where darkness had made its home. She walked for what felt like hours, though she could not be certain how much time had passed in her delirious state, her vision blurring and her legs threatening to give out beneath her with every painful step she forced herself to take. And then she saw it rising before her like something from a dream, a massive castle made of black stone that seemed to absorb the little moonlight that managed to break through the clouds, its towers reaching so high they disappeared into the mist that hung over everything like a funeral shroud. Elena should have been terrified by the sight of this place that radiated ancient power and danger, but instead she felt something unexpected blooming in her chest as she stared at those dark walls, something that felt almost like hope despite everything she had been taught to believe about the creature who lived within. She climbed the stone steps leading to the enormous wooden doors, her hand reaching out to touch the iron knocker shaped like a snarling wolf. And before she could even lift it to announce her presence, the doors swung open on their own as if the castle itself had been expecting her arrival all along. The warmth that rushed out to greet her was the most wonderful thing Elena had ever felt, and she stumbled across the threshold into a grand entrance hall lit by hundreds of candles that floated in the air without any visible support, their flames dancing gently as if welcoming her home. She took 3 more steps before her body finally surrendered to exhaustion, and the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her consciousness was a figure descending the massive staircase at the center of the hall, moving with inhuman grace and speed toward her falling form, pale hands reaching out to catch her before she hit the marble floor. When Alina opened her eyes again, she found herself lying in the softest bed she had ever touched, covered in silk blankets that seemed to radiate gentle warmth. And for a long moment, she simply lay there in confusion, wondering if she had died in the forest and somehow found herself in a version of heaven she had never been told about. The room around her was decorated with dark elegance, tapestries depicting ancient battles hanging on the walls, and a fire crackled peacefully in a massive stone fireplace that took up nearly half of one wall. She sat up slowly, her hand immediately going to her belly to check on her child, and she nearly cried with relief when she felt the familiar movements that told her the baby was still alive and well despite everything they had been through together. But her relief was cut short when she noticed she was not alone in the room, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the figure sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, watching her with eyes that glowed like molten silver in the firelight. The Vampire King was nothing like the monster she had been expecting from all the stories she had heard throughout her life, and Alina found herself unable to look away from his face as he rose slowly from his chair and approached the bed with measured steps that spoke of ancient patience and carefully controlled power. He was beautiful in a way that human men could never hope to be, his features sharp and perfect as if carved from the finest marble, his dark hair falling past his shoulders like a river of shadows, and his presence filled the room with an intensity that made it difficult for Alina to breathe properly. He stopped at the foot of the bed and studied her with those inhuman eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was deep and smooth like velvet sliding over her skin, carrying centuries of wisdom and loneliness that Alina could somehow sense beneath the surface of his carefully controlled expression. He told her that she had been unconscious for 2 days while his servants tended to her wounds and made sure her child was healthy, and that she was free to leave whenever she wished, but he strongly advised against returning to the world that had treated her so cruelly. Alina wanted to thank him for his kindness, but instead she found herself asking him why. Why would the terrifying Vampire King that everyone feared save the life of a worthless pregnant woman who had wandered uninvited into his domain? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for just a moment, Alina saw something flicker in those silver eyes, something that looked almost like pain before he quickly concealed it behind his mask of cold indifference. He turned away from her and walked toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the dark forest that surrounded his castle like a protective barrier against the world that had long ago decided he was a monster who deserved only hatred and fear. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, and Alina had to strain to hear his words as he told her something that would change everything she thought she knew about the creature the villagers had taught her to fear since childhood. He said that 800 years ago, before he became what he was now, he had a wife who carried his child, and he had failed to protect them when enemies came to destroy everything he loved. and he had been cursed to live forever with the memory of that failure burning in his chest like a wound that would never heal. He said that when he saw Elena lying unconscious on his doorstep, something inside him that he thought had died centuries ago suddenly awakened, and he found himself unable to turn away from her the way the rest of the world had done without any hesitation. Elena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to his story, her heart breaking for this ancient being who had suffered alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to let anyone see his pain. And she understood in that moment that they were both survivors of a world that had no use for people who did not fit neatly into the roles expected of them. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him that she understood his loneliness because she felt it too. But before she could say anything, the doors to the chamber burst open and a terrified servant rushed in with news that made the Vampire King's face grow darker than the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. The villagers were coming, the servant gasped, hundreds of them carrying torches and weapons, led by a man who claimed that Elena belonged to him and demanded she be returned immediately so he could punish her for running away. Elena's blood ran cold as she recognized the description of the man leading the mob toward the castle, because it was none other than Marcus, the man who had sworn he loved her, the man who had abandoned her the moment he learned she was pregnant, the man who had apparently decided that if he could not have her, no one else would either. The Vampire King turned to look at Elena, and in his silver eyes she saw a question forming, a question that would determine what happened next in this dangerous game that had suddenly become so much more complicated than either of them had expected. What would she choose? He asked her quietly. Would she go back to the man who had thrown her away like garbage, or would she stay here in the darkness with a monster who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had received in her entire life? The choice that changed everything. Elena looked into the eyes of the Vampire King and saw something there that she had never expected to find in the gaze of a creature everyone called a monster, something that looked remarkably like hope mixed with fear, as if he genuinely cared what her answer would be, but was already preparing himself for the rejection he had grown accustomed to receiving over the centuries of his lonely existence. She thought about everything she had experienced in her short life, the cruelty of people who should have loved her unconditionally, the betrayal of the man who had claimed her heart only to shatter it completely, and the strange sense of safety she felt in this dark castle that should have terrified her beyond all reason. The sounds of the approaching mob grew louder outside, their angry voices carrying through the night air like a storm of hatred and ignorance. And Elena knew she had only moments to make a decision that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of her unborn child who had done nothing wrong except be conceived by a mother who had trusted the wrong person. She placed both hands on her swollen belly, feeling the gentle movements of the life growing inside her, and in that moment of clarity, she knew exactly what she needed to do. She told the Vampire King that she would stay, and she watched as something remarkable happened to his ancient face, the mask of cold indifference cracking just enough to reveal the profound loneliness that had been his constant companion for 800 years. And she saw what might have been the beginning of tears in those silver eyes before he quickly turned away to compose himself. He told her that she had made her choice, and now he would make his, and he strode toward the door with a purpose that made the air itself seem to tremble around him. Elena called out to him, begging him not to hurt the villagers despite everything they had done to her, and the Vampire King paused at the doorway with his back still turned, his powerful form silhouetted against the flickering candlelight that illuminated the corridor beyond. She explained that those people were afraid and ignorant, that they had been taught to hate anything different from themselves since the day they were born, and that killing them would only prove that the stories they told about him were true. The Vampire King turned to look at her over his shoulder, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as if seeing something he had not encountered in centuries, as if her mercy toward those who had shown her none was something so rare and precious that he could barely comprehend its existence. He asked her how she could possibly feel compassion for people who had thrown her out into the rain to die, who had turned their backs on a pregnant woman begging for shelter, who were now coming to drag her back to a man who would surely make her life a living nightmare. Elena smiled sadly and told him that hate was easy, that anyone could hate those who had wronged them, but choosing to respond with kindness when the world offered only cruelty was the only way to break the cycle that caused so much suffering. She said that she had spent her whole life being treated as if she was worthless, and she had finally realized that becoming hard and bitter would only mean that those cruel people had won, had succeeded in destroying the gentle heart her grandmother had always told her was her greatest strength. The Vampire King was silent for a long time, processing her words with the weight of centuries behind his thoughts, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer than Elena had ever heard it, filled with something that sounded almost like wonder. He told her that in 800 years of existence, he had met thousands of humans, and not one of them had ever asked him to show mercy to their enemies, and he did not understand how someone who had suffered so much could still believe in the power of kindness. Elena pushed herself out of the bed, ignoring the weakness in her legs, and walked slowly toward the Vampire King until she stood close enough to see the faint scars on his face that time had almost erased, the marks of battles fought so long ago that the world had forgotten they ever happened. She reached up and placed her hand on his cold cheek, and she felt him flinch at her touch, as if human warmth was something painful and unfamiliar that he had trained himself to avoid. She told him that kindness was not weakness, that it took far more courage to offer compassion to those who did not deserve it than to simply destroy everything in your path, and she asked him to trust her, to believe that there was another way to handle this situation that did not require blood to be spilled. The Vampire King closed his eyes and leaned slightly into her touch, and Elena watched as a single tear escaped from beneath his lashes and traced a silver path down his pale cheek, the first tear he had shed in more years than he could remember. He opened his eyes and looked down at her with an expression that made Elena's heart skip in her chest, and he told her that he would do as she asked, that he would give her this gift, because she was the first person in 8 centuries to look at him and see something other than a monster. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Elena standing there with her heart pounding and her mind racing as she tried to understand what had just passed between them. She followed him as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, moving through corridors of dark stone decorated with centuries of accumulated treasures, past ancient suits of armor and paintings of people whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the immortal being who had known them personally. By the time she reached the entrance hall, The Vampire King was already standing before the great doors, his servants gathered behind him with expressions of fear and uncertainty on their pale faces. The doors opened to reveal the angry mob standing at the bottom of the castle steps, their torches casting dancing shadows across faces twisted with hatred and fear, their weapons raised and ready to strike at the creature they had been taught to believe was the source of all evil in their region. At the front of the mob stood Marcus, the man Elena had once loved with all her heart, and she felt a wave of disgust wash over her as she looked at his handsome face, now distorted by rage and wounded pride. Marcus shouted up at the Vampire King, demanding that he release Elena immediately or face the consequences of defying the will of the people, and his voice was filled with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. He claimed that Elena belonged to him, that she was carrying his child, and had no right to run away from her responsibilities, and that he would burn the castle to the ground if that was what it took to reclaim what was his property. Elena felt anger surge through her veins at his words, at the casual way he referred to her as if she was nothing more than an object to be owned and controlled, and she stepped forward to stand beside the Vampire King, her chin lifted in defiance despite the fear that made her hands tremble. She told Marcus that she was not his property, that she had never been his property, and that she would rather die in this dark castle than spend another moment with a man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Marcus's face turned red with fury at her words, and he screamed that she was making a fool of herself by choosing a monster over a respectable man who was willing to forgive her shameful behavior and take her back despite the embarrassment she had caused him. He told the mob that the Vampire King had obviously bewitched her, had used dark magic to turn her against her own people, and that they needed to save her from herself even if she was too corrupted to appreciate their efforts. The Vampire King spoke then, his voice carrying across the night with a power that made several members of the mob take frightened steps backward, and he told them that Elena had made her choice freely, and that anyone who tried to take her against her will would discover exactly why the stories about him had survived for so many centuries. But then he said something that surprised everyone present, including Elena, who had thought she was beginning to understand him. He told the mob that he was giving them one chance to turn around and go home peacefully, that he was choosing not to punish them for their trespass, because the woman standing beside him had asked him to show them mercy, and that they should thank her for saving their lives tonight. The confusion on the faces of the villagers was almost comical, as they had clearly expected violence and bloodshed rather than this strange offer of peace from a creature they believed incapable of anything but darkness. Marcus was not about to accept defeat so easily, and he raised his torch high above his head, screaming for the mob to attack, to burn the castle and destroy the monster inside. But something unexpected happened before anyone could move. An old woman pushed her way through the crowd and walked slowly up the steps toward Elena, her weathered face showing no fear despite the dangerous situation she was walking into. And Elena recognized her immediately as the healer who had helped her grandmother in her final days. The old woman told the mob that she had lived longer than any of them and had learned things about the Vampire King that they had never been told, and she said that the stories they believed were only half the truth, twisted by generations of fear and misunderstanding. She revealed that centuries ago, the Vampire King had saved her ancestor from a terrible plague that was killing everyone in the village, that he had used his own blood to create a cure and asked for nothing in return, except that people leave him in peace. The crowd began to murmur uncertainly, their confidence shaken by this revelation from a woman they all respected for her wisdom and healing abilities, and even Marcus seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. The old woman turned to face Alina and the Vampire King, and she smiled with a warmth that seemed out of place in such a tense situation, telling them that kindness always found its way back to those who offered it freely. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night air, and everyone turned to see one of the young men from the mob clutching his chest and collapsing to the ground, his torch falling from his hands and setting fire to the dry grass beneath his feet. The old woman's eyes widened with recognition, and she called out that it was the same poison that had killed so many centuries ago, and that it had somehow returned to threaten the village once again. The Vampire King moved so fast that Alina could barely track his motion, appearing beside the fallen man in the blink of an eye and pressing his hand against the young man's forehead with an expression of intense concentration. When he looked up, his silver eyes were grave, and he announced that the old woman was right, that this was the same ancient poison he had encountered 800 years ago, and that it would spread through the village within days if something was not done immediately. Marcus shouted that this was obviously a trick, that the Vampire King had poisoned their people to make himself look like a hero, but his words fell flat as more villagers began showing the same symptoms, clutching their chests and struggling to breathe as the mysterious illness spread through the crowd with terrifying speed. Alina watched in horror as chaos erupted among the mob, their hatred forgotten in the face of this new and deadly threat, and she looked at the Vampire King with a desperate question in her eyes. He met her gaze, and she saw the weight of centuries in his expression as he told her that he could create a cure, but it would require something that the villagers would never willingly give him, and he asked if she truly believed that kindness was powerful enough to bridge the gap between monsters and men. The miracle of mercy. The night hung heavy with fear and uncertainty as Alina stood between two worlds, watching the villagers who had once cast her out, now falling victim to a poison that seemed to have emerged from the darkest chapters of history to remind everyone that there were forces in this world far more terrifying than any vampire king. She looked at the creature beside her, this ancient being who had every reason to let these people suffer for the hatred they had shown him, and she saw him struggling with a decision that would reveal whether the monster they believed him to be was real or simply a mask he had worn for protection. The Vampire King told her and the gathered crowd that the cure required freely given blood from a human who harbored no fear or hatred in their heart, blood offered with genuine compassion and trust, and that in 800 years he had never found a human capable of such selfless generosity toward one of his kind. The villagers exchanged terrified glances, their prejudices warring with their desperate need to save their friends and family members who were collapsing one by one on the cold ground. And Alina could see that none of them would be able to overcome their fear, even to save their own lives. She stepped forward before anyone could stop her, announcing that she would give her blood freely and without fear. And she watched the Vampire King's silver eyes widen with something that looked remarkably like terror at the thought of putting her at risk when she was already so vulnerable. He told her no, told her that she was pregnant and weakened, and that he could not take her blood without potentially harming her or the child she carried. And for the first time since she had met him, she heard genuine fear in his ancient voice. Elena took his cold hand in hers and told him that she trusted him completely, that she knew in her heart that he would never hurt her or her baby, and that this was exactly the kind of moment her grandmother had always told her about, the moments that defined who a person truly was when everything seemed impossible. Tears were streaming down her face as she spoke, but her voice was steady with a conviction that seemed to surprise everyone watching, including the vampire king, who looked at her as if she had just handed him a gift he never dared to hope for. Marcus pushed forward through the crowd, screaming that Elena was insane, that she was going to let a monster drink her blood and probably kill her along with his child, and his words were filled with a desperation that revealed how little he actually understood about what was happening. But before he could reach them, several villagers grabbed him and held him back, their faces showing the first signs of the change that was sweeping through the crowd as they watched this pregnant woman offer herself to save people who had shown her nothing but cruelty. The old healer approached Elena and placed a weathered hand on her arm, telling her that she was the bravest soul she had ever encountered in all her years, and that whatever happened next, the world would remember this night as the moment when everything changed between humans and the creature they had feared for so long. Elena smiled at the old woman and thanked her for being the first person from the village to show her kindness, and she turned back to the vampire king with her arm extended, ready to give him what he needed to save the very people who had wanted him destroyed. The vampire king's hands trembled as he gently took her wrist, and Elena saw the war raging behind his silver eyes as centuries of hunger and loneliness crashed against the profound respect he had developed for this remarkable woman who stood before him without a trace of fear. He told her that he would take only what was absolutely necessary, that he would protect her with every fiber of his immortal being, and that he would spend the rest of eternity repaying her for this gift if she would allow him the honor. Elena nodded, and in that moment of perfect trust between an ancient vampire and a pregnant human woman, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself, as if the universe was acknowledging that a miracle was about to occur. The vampire king pressed his lips to her wrist with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of his power, and Elena felt no pain, only a strange warmth that spread through her body like sunlight after a long winter, filling every corner of her soul with a peace she had never known before. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the vampire king took what he needed and then immediately sealed the wound with his own blood, and they saw that Elena remained standing, her face glowing with an inner light that made her look almost divine in the flickering torchlight. He mixed her blood with herbs and components that appeared seemingly from nowhere, his hands moving with the speed and precision of someone who had performed this ritual before, and within moments he held a vial of liquid that shimmered with an otherworldly radiance. He moved through the fallen villagers with care and compassion that contradicted everything they had ever been told about him, placing drops of the cure on the lips of each person who had succumbed to the poison, and one by one they began to recover, their breathing steadying and color returning to their cheeks. The crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief and gratitude as they watched their loved ones being saved by the monster they had come to destroy, and Elena saw the moment when centuries of hatred began to crumble in the face of undeniable kindness. Marcus stood alone as the transformation swept through the crowd, his supporters abandoning him one by one as they rushed to check on family members who had been saved by the Vampire King's cure, and his handsome face twisted with rage and disbelief as he realized that his power over these people had disappeared in a single night. He pulled a silver dagger from his belt, a weapon he had brought specifically to harm the Vampire King, and he lunged toward Alina with murder in his eyes, screaming that if he could not have her, then no one would. But he never reached her, because the Vampire King moved faster than any human eye could follow, placing himself between Marcus and Alina with a snarl that revealed his true nature for the first time that night. The dagger plunged into the Vampire King's chest instead, and Alina screamed as she watched the ancient creature who had shown her such kindness crumple to the ground, with silver poison spreading through his immortal veins. The villagers surged forward and subdued Marcus, who was still screaming about monsters and property and his wounded pride, and Alina dropped to her knees beside the Vampire King, tears pouring down her face as she begged him not to leave her alone in a world that had only made sense since she met him. His silver eyes were dimming as he looked up at her, and he whispered that he had finally found something worth dying for, that saving her was the first truly good thing he had done in 800 years, and that he could face oblivion knowing that she was safe. Alina refused to accept his words, and she did something that shocked everyone watching, including the Vampire King himself, who stared at her with an expression of pure wonder as she lifted her wrist to her own lips and bit down hard enough to draw blood. She pressed her bleeding wrist to his mouth and told him to drink, told him that she was offering her blood freely just as she had before, and that if her trust had been strong enough to create a cure for the villagers, then it would be strong enough to save him from the silver poison. The Vampire King tried to resist, tried to push her away to protect her from himself, but Alina held firm with a strength she did not know she possessed, and finally, his survival instincts overcame his nobility and he drank. The silver poison retreated from his veins as her freely given blood swept through his system like a river of pure light, and color returned to his pale face as the wound in his chest began to close before everyone's astonished eyes. When he finally pulled away from her wrist and sealed the wound with his blood, the Vampire King looked at Alina with an expression that held 8 centuries of loneliness transforming into something beautiful and new. He told her that she had just done something impossible, that she had saved an immortal creature with nothing but her trust and her compassion, and that he would spend the rest of eternity trying to deserve the gift she had given him. Alina smiled through her tears and told him that he already deserved it, that she had seen his heart from the moment she woke up in his castle, and that she was done running from people who wanted to hurt her. She was going to stay here, in this dark forest, with this ancient creature, and she was going to build a life for herself and her child in the only place that had ever truly felt like home. The old healer stepped forward and announced to the villagers that they had witnessed something sacred, that the Vampire King was not their enemy, but a protector they had forgotten how to trust, and that it was time to build bridges instead of burning them. One by one, the villagers came forward to thank the creature they had come to destroy, their hatred replaced by gratitude and shame for how wrong they had been. Months later, Alina gave birth to a healthy daughter in the Vampire King's castle, surrounded by servants who had become family and villagers who now visited regularly to seek healing and wisdom from the ancient creature in the dark forest. The Vampire King held the baby girl with a tenderness that seemed impossible for one so powerful, and Alina watched as tears streamed down his face, while he promised the child that he would protect her for as long as he existed. Marcus was long gone, banished from the region by the very people he had once manipulated, and Alina never thought about him anymore because she had found something far more precious than the false love he had offered. She had found a home, a family, and a love that defied every boundary she had ever been taught to believe in. And in the centuries that followed, stories were told of the kind vampire king and his human queen, the pregnant woman who had wandered into the darkness seeking shelter and had found something far more valuable than safety. She had found proof that kindness was the most powerful force in the universe, and that even the most ancient wounds could be healed by someone brave enough to offer their heart without expecting anything in return.